Before we start, I read you a piece of material that I wasn't expecting, and it gave me a thought I hadn't had before. That's not unusual. I have lots of thoughts I've never had. What I thought was particularly good. When we as Christians pray for someone to be brought to normal physically, okay, and they die, we got a prayer answer. Because now they're physically normal in heaven. And I never thought about that, but more thought about it than I liked that we get our, even we get our prayer answered positively when we don't get our prayer answered positively. Anyway, that has nothing to do with the lesson. That's free. We give you these little tidbits along the way without charging. We are looking at premillennialism. We're looking at the core issues of premillennialism. They create problems when you start trying to study with them and with their belief system. And the first one we're working on right now is, we're still on the first one, but it is the idea that all scripture prophecy has to be interpreted literally or it doesn't work. That's their view, and they're sticking to it, kind of, sort of. We'll be pointing up issues along the way where they have difficulty even with their own doctrine, because virtually anytime you say you always do something, there's a good chance there's going to be a glitch in there somewhere, because always is a hard thing to continue doing no matter what it is. But they do say they will want to interpret prophetic scripture literally. So let's look at another one here tonight, see where we get to. Look at Isaiah chapter 11. This is not familiar. I wouldn't expect it to be familiar to you. But it does make a very interesting point. It says, Ephraim's jealousy will vanish, and Judah's enemies will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, nor Judah hostile toward Ephraim. They will swoop down on the slopes of Philistia to the west. Together, they will plunder the people of the east. They will lay hands on Sodom and Moab, and will be resurrected. And the Amorites will be subject to them. All right. Now, the part I want you to notice is that Ephraim represents the northern kingdom. Okay. Judah, of course, represents the southern kingdom. And the Philistines will be resurrected if this is literally interpreted. There are no Philistines that I'm aware of on the earth today. So if Israel is going to come down on the Philistines, somehow we got to get the Philistines resurrected before they can come down on them. But there's more things here than that. Obviously, the Edomites, the Amorites, and the other nations also have to be resurrected, because they're not in existence either. And even the millennialists really don't believe that. They can't figure out how you're going to get all these nations back into existence, literally. But there's something else that's even more interesting. In Isaiah 37 and verse 32, Ezekiel says the northern and the southern kingdom will be one. Now, literally interpreted, was Ezekiel confused? He has to have been confused to some degree, because in one place he says they're one nation. In other places, that it's two nations, two kingdoms. One nation, two kingdoms. But it can't be both. It's going to be one or the other. And so you see that we have a problem here of trying to bring the two scriptures, or even the book of Ezekiel, together in agreement, if it's legal. If it's figurative, it's no real problem. Now, John Walford, in the Premillennial Kingdom book that I brought and showed you, that's the basic textbook of Premillennialism, on page 298, he says that Isaiah 11 paints a graphic picture of Jesus' reign on earth, which cannot be confused with the present day. Interpreted literally, you would not find the present age. Remember now, there is no church age if you're a premillennialist. We're in that holding period between two kingdoms. The church was just unthought of by the prophets of old. They were not aware of the church at all. So everything in the Old Testament that refers to the kingdom, which many times, not every time, but many times refers to the church as God's kingdom coming in AD 33. The premillennialist says, no, that's the kingdom that Christ was going to set up, but what happened? We went over this a couple of weeks ago. Important for our study, or I wouldn't bring it up again. Remember, Jesus came and was rejected by the Jews, and therefore he was not able to set up that kingdom that he was sent here to set up. So then he had God knew that was going to happen. He just didn't tell anybody, which God has a right not to tell anybody everything, except it doesn't really jive with Scripture. But the premillennialists will say that God then put a parenthesis in time, or a stopgap in time, and we of the present age are between two kingdoms. We're in neither one. Okay, we're not in the first kingdom that was set up in the Old Testament. We're not in the second kingdom set up of Christ, because according to them, Christ has not yet set that kingdom up, but he will set it up one day when he comes back and sets up a kingdom in Jerusalem and reigns there 1,000 years. Okay, that's their belief, and we're going to repeat that over and over and over. You're going to have it down by the time we're through to where you can say sleep probably. And you're going to think, why do I want to say that in my sleep? I don't know, but you might. You never know when it could be important. All right, so another fallacy in the idea of trying to make everything literal. All right, got another one for you. Look at Micah. Part of what I'm doing too, we're going through a lot of different prophets here, showing that it's not just one prophet that they misuse, nor is it one prophet who only speaks figuratively and the rest speak literally. No, you can go through all the prophets and find the same idea. But I'm doing this for the purpose of illustrating over and over and over that their idea will not work. It will not jive with the truth of the Bible or the truth of the gospel. All right, look at Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clan of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. That's a prophecy of what?
Correct.
Okay, the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. Okay? No problem with that. We'd all agree with that. Is that going to literally come true? It definitely will literally come true. All right. So a little interpretation. So then I want you to look at 3 verses later in verse 5. And he will be their peace when the Assyrians invade our land and marches through our fortresses. We will raise him 7 shepherds, even 8 leaders of men. Okay, if that's Israel, and this is Christ being born in Bethlehem, and you take this literally, what's going to happen after Christ is born? The Assyrians have got to come through. Now, I'm not sure that I have all the versions of the Bible that are out there, but I don't think I've read one yet that mentions the Assyrians coming through after Christ is born. Why? Why would he use Assyria? Why would he say Assyria? Some of these scholars say the invasion called Assyria is really Gog and Magog, but that requires using a figure of speech equivalent to literal. Because if you say this stands for something, even if you're wrong, even in that, but if you say something stands for something, what do you say? That's figurative. Okay? So when they want to say, we'll deal with Gog and Magog, don't worry. We'll get to them. But for now, they want to say, some scholars, not all premillennialists agree on this, but some of them want to say that this invasion of Assyria is really Gog and Magog. Well, whatever Gog and Magog are, if you say it stands for them, then you're saying the verse is figurative. So even those scholars, would have to admit that everything is not interpreted literally.
Okay, then what advantage or what meaning were they supposed to draw from this?
Well, I'll get to that in just a second. Okay, history tells us that Assyria was eliminated in 612 BC. So there is no way, historically, that Assyria can come through Palestine after the birth of Christ, or even around the birth of Christ, anywhere close to the birth of Christ. Because 600 years before that, they have been eliminated. It was destroyed in the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. The battle was so decisive. The victory was so great. The defeat of Assyria was so astounding that Alexander the Great, who came many years later, camped on the spot where Assyria was and had no idea that there was ever a nation there. It was completely, absolutely destroyed. Now, someone might ask, why would God use that Assyria? In fact, someone did ask that. That's amazing. Thank you. Proves my point. Okay. Micah is simply saying that when the Messiah comes, he will defeat all the enemies of Satan. Okay? He uses the enemy of the day. Who's the enemy of the day at that time? Assyria. When the prophecy is written, he's making the point that Christ will overcome all enemies. He uses the enemy of Assyria to make that point. Because at that time, that's who they related to as the enemy. That was their enemy. And to pick any other enemy would be something that wouldn't make sense to them. Assyria would make very good sense. If he can beat Assyria, if Christ can defeat Assyria, Messiah can effectively defeat Assyria, we had nothing to worry about. Because that was the big enemy of the day, and that's who he's using as his example of an enemy, not specifically the nation of Assyria anymore than he uses it specifically in a lot of other cases. This is just one where the point I want to make here, in addition to that, is here in one verse, well, in 2 verses, span of 3 verses, you see the prophet using something literal and the prophet using something figurative together in the same paragraph, in the same thought. So what I'm trying to say over and over and over and over is, you cannot make it one or the other. The prophecies of the Old Testament are neither all figurative nor all literal, because when you try to do that, it won't work. But you have to go through it with an understanding of the New Testament of Scripture and be willing to see that this was a figurative statement used to illustrate a point. It would be the same thing today if someone was talking about God overcoming an enemy and writing a book to America. Okay, or writing a book to us as Christians who live in America. Okay, if God can overcome China, Russia, pick an enemy. I mean, we have plenty. Not the church, but the nation of America. Okay, how does he explain the enemy? Well, if you're old enough, in here, for example, you're old enough that he can use the name Hitler and everybody would go, oh, okay, because Hitler is one of the major enemies of all time to America. But in a few years, and probably if I drop down in age groups in this building, I could say Hitler and they'd go, who? Because they don't know Hitler, okay? What would they know? Well, they might know Iran. They might know current enemies. So the enemy changes in the Old Testament to fit the time period and the people being written to. Okay? So it's not a nation, it's not a specific group, it is a representation, figurative representation of the enemy of God, which would be Satan. But it doesn't mean that all the people that Satan, somehow they all had tails and hearts. It doesn't mean that either. It's simply a figurative way of expressing the enemy. Who is the enemy of God? All right? In Isaiah 19, verses 18 through 25, we won't read those, but I'll tell you what it says. It says to Egypt will come to know God. Egypt will worship and sacrifice to God, and will be struck by God with a plague, and will be healed and return to God. And that there must be a highway between Assyria and Egypt, which works well if you're John the Baptist being Elijah building a highway. So you got a job to do there. You got a highway to build, except that's not what it's talking about. But nonetheless, the two will come together and be joined by Israel in worship to God. Now, I do not think that in our history of the world, that has ever happened. Egypt and Assyria. Kind of hard to do right now since Assyria is not around. Egypt still is around, but they have no one to join up with Israel. So you can well imagine the premillennialists are waiting for this to take place. So if it doesn't happen, hasn't happened up until now, what is the rule of the premillennialists? If it hasn't happened up to now, it's got to happen sometime in the future, because they will agree that the Bible's correct. This is one point we are in agreement with them on. You know, they are, by denominational terms, premillennialists are basically very, very conservative. Okay? Because they want the Bible to be proven to be true, which is a good thing, by the way. But they want it to be proven true in a literal sense, and that's where they have difficulties. All right, so Isaiah is making a different point or different argument altogether than the argument that they are attributing to Isaiah. When the prophets talk about Israel being vindicated, when they are proven to be right, they're proven that by staying with God, they did the right thing, and they're vindicated for what they did. There's three ways that the prophets show this. Number one, they talk about Israel defeating their enemies. Okay, that's vindication of Israel, not defeating enemies. Vindication of Israel. In other words, Israel was right. How do you know they were right? Because they defeated the enemy. They had to be right. God supported them. They beat the enemy. They win, and therefore it shows that they were correct, and that God was behind Israel and stayed with Israel and proved Israel to be correct. Number two, the enemies are seen as being punished by plagues in the prophets now. When the prophet goes and writes about the vindication of Israel, how do you know Israel's right? What proof is there that Israel will be proven to be God's people? The prophet will use the idea of a plague coming on the enemies. In other words, God. Now, how would that vindicate? How would that prove anything to a good Jewish person reading the prophets? Why would they see that as vindication? Because that's what they saw in Egypt. God vindicated Israel out of Egyptian bondage using what? Plagues on Egypt. So a good way to show the same idea that God's going to rescue Israel, that God's going to vindicate Israel, is to use the idea of plagues, because they immediately will relate that back to the Egyptian experience. Now, would I relate it to that if I didn't have the Bible? No, I wouldn't know to relate it to that. So are these prophecies written to the whole world? No. They're written to a specific group of people, God's people, Israel. He uses words and phrases and ideas that will trigger thoughts in the mind of the hearers of the prophecy, and that being the Israelites. So the second way, first way being Israel beats the fire out of the enemies. Second way, the plagues fall on their enemies, and as they did with Egypt and the Egyptian bondage. And then the third, and probably most interesting of the three, is the enemies are shown as converting to believers in God. Not necessarily Judaism, although at this time it would be Judaism. But in other words, what is the total vindication of Israel? What is the total defeat of the enemy? When the enemy says, Jehovah's God. Now, did that literally happen? No. You know, nations, entire nations didn't suddenly become believers in God. Egypt didn't become a believer in God. We went after the plagues. There were some Egyptians who did join the Jewish people when they left Egypt, in fact. But it certainly wasn't a national thing. And Pharaoh's household probably didn't get too thrilled with it, was the way things turned out for them. So it's not meant as literal at all. It's a figurative statement showing domination and submission, vindication and punishment. Israel's vindicated, Israel comes out on top, the enemies are defeated, whoever the enemies are, and it's illustrated, or it's figuratively stated, as they begin to go and worship God. So now that all sounded real good, and you sat there and nodded your heads as you were supposed to, and probably didn't get a thing out of it, did it? But you nodded,
What
yes.
you're doing is, today we would say we're vindicated after death whenever we go and face God. And then the enemies of God, when they die, they realize, oops, we made a mistake.
Right.
I mean, that's a vindication there.
Right, and that's how we're going to be our final vindication. Christians' final vindication is going to be they're in heaven and the other folks are not. Okay, now because you might have questioned what I just said, because I just rattled that off like I knew what I was talking about, but I didn't give you the proof text at all for it. Let me give you something. If you look, you don't have to look right now, but in Isaiah chapter 34, beginning in verse 5, and for much of that chapter, which we're not going to read, but you can go home and read it later if you care to. I will summarize what it says, the point I want to make from it. Okay, if you take Isaiah 34, 5 and following, and you take it literally, Edom would have to be resurrected and then set on fire, which will burn forever. Okay? That's what Isaiah 34, verse 5 and following says. Now, it says the porcupine and the pelican will dwell in the land. I mean, that's what it says. I'm not making this up. You can check me out. Now, I don't know how many porcupines or pelicans you've seen, but I have never seen one that I think could survive fire. The land's on fire, according to Isaiah. Unless you put the porcupine and the pelican in some kind of fire-resistant suits, there's not going to be anything to eat, there's not going to be much to drink, and everything's on fire. That would be hard to imagine coming literally true.
Well, all the stars of heaven will be dissolved.
And that would be hard to imagine. Yeah. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about judgment on Edom. Edom is going to be judged. Edom is going to be destroyed. And what illustration? The fire. What does that remind you of? Now put yourself, now don't think like a nice Christian Gentile. Think like a nice Jewish person of the Old Testament. When you hear a fire burning forever, what comes to your mind?
Yeah.
It doesn't come, hell doesn't come. What does come?
Yeah.
How about Sodom and Gomorrah? Because here's the fire, here's destruction, here's judgment. And it's saying there, Isaiah is using an allusion back to Sodom and Gomorrah with the fire. The porcupine pelican, I don't want to put that in. I really don't know. I have no idea why. I know I'm understanding, God put it there for a reason. I'm not sure why. Because I don't see how that really fits in, but it does show that it has to be figurative as opposed to literal. But point being that it is complete. When you talk about complete destruction to a Jewish person in that era, in that period of time, nothing came closer to it than Sodom and Gomorrah because it was destroyed. When we talk about total destruction in America, and I hate using these, but I do not want you to ever confuse me saying anything of American history fitting into scripture. It does not. Please know that. I'm not trying to make that point at all. What I'm trying to get you to think about is, if I was going to describe total destruction of something to you, what would I use that would work? Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of things I could use, but I guarantee you most of you here, if I said Nagasaki, you'd go, oh, yeah, atomic bombs, blows things up, destroys things, completely destroys things. That's a literal fact that literally happened that I can refer back to that brings to your mind total destruction. Now, if you think it would bring total destruction to your mind, imagine what it would do to the Japanese mind. Because they were the ones that got hit. Okay? Probably wouldn't bring joy toward America, but nonetheless, it would illustrate the point. The point is total destruction. So when we talk about total destruction, we would use illustrations of our current time period that would bring about the same idea. Now, we don't have a good illustration of God raining down fire from heaven, so the atomic bombs of World War II would be as close to fire falling out of heaven and destroying things probably as I could come up with when I was trying to come up with an illustration of this. And even we wouldn't appreciate it the way they would appreciate it, okay? Where Sodom and Gomorrah were completely destroyed, they were never to return, whereas Japan obviously was rebuilt and came back. But point being, it's the idea of total, absolute destruction. All right. Now, one more very quickly. Ezekiel chapter 45, beginning in verse 17. In fact, those of you who are here who didn't get to finish Ezekiel with me because of COVID, I told you we'd get back to it. Well, we are right now. We're now covering the last part of Ezekiel. We're going to do it in a hurry. We're not going to spend much time on it, so it does finish out my study of Ezekiel. Because this is where we want to go. Chapter 45 and beginning in verse 17. If literally understood, meat offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, and so forth, according to that, are coming back. Okay? Even the sin offering is coming back, and that's important. Keep that one in mind above the others. Because if this is futuristic, if this is a future prophecy, because it hasn't happened yet, okay? According to literally, it has not happened. We would agree with that. It hasn't happened. If it's literal, the premillennial says it's coming back. We're gonna have a whole unit on this particular idea. So don't worry that you don't get it right now. I'm introducing it right now. If the sin offering is coming back into existence, then why did Christ die on the cross? And the entire book of Hebrews is a waste of time. Because the entire book of Hebrews is teaching people to stop living under the old law, live under the new law, new covenant, knowing that Christ came back and died one time for all sin. Yet if the sin offering is coming back, why? For what purpose? We have the sin offering already given. We don't need another one.
Roger,
Yes, ma'am.
I'm confused. I'm gonna show my ignorance here.
No.
Because you said that the offerings had not happened yet.
Well,
But they did
well,
do that.
the offerings of the Old Testament have come and gone.
Okay,
And Christ came and died on the cross to be the sin offering for all time,
right.
especially according to the book of Hebrews. Yet, this says, it's kind of, I get my Ezekiel's and my Isaiah's confused, so I want to make sure I get the right. Okay, Ezekiel says that they're coming back.
Oh, okay, so this is
So
a
if it's literal,
prophecy that hasn't
yeah,
happened.
if it's taken literally, for
Okay.
what reason would they need to come back? If it's figurative, which it is, we can explain that. I mean, that's explainable as a figurative statement, but not literal. And I know I'm leaving you in the air a little bit because I'm not going back and explaining how all these are fulfilled from Ezekiel. But that if we're gonna, I'll be here for the next 10 years trying to prove all this stuff out each and every time with each prophecy, how it was fulfilled in the time of Ezekiel or Daniel or wherever we are. So for the moment, please say my word on it. And if you have any questions, I'll give you my outline on Ezekiel and you can see how that works out. But all right. Now, also, Ezekiel chapter 37 through chapter 48, obviously a big chunk of scripture, which we're obviously not going to read, is associated with the return of David. Okay? David hasn't returned. Therefore, premillennialists say he's coming back. When is he coming back? Guess when?
In 1,000 years.
Exactly. See, everything is geared to that time period. Everything that hasn't been fulfilled will be. David had returned, therefore David must be coming back then. We talked about this a lot last week. And by the way, as I'm closing out here, let me assure you that the man of the hour, Dewey Howard, told me just before class started, he apologized for not getting last week's lesson up, but he will get it up and you will be able to see last week's lesson, which will make this week's lesson make a little more sense than it does now because you don't have benefit. I was going to, if it didn't get recorded, I was going to all but reteach last week's lesson. But he said that it was up, and so I'm going, okay, I don't want to bore you twice, those of you who are here, with the same material. So please, though, if you have a chance, please, as the videos hit the internet, if you're not here for one, please see it. I'm not that good. I don't claim to be. You're not doing me any great favors, but I'm building from one week to the next, and if you don't have some of the stepping stones in between, this is confusing enough. It'll be more confusing without the stepping stones in between. So please, if you get a chance, if you miss class, go back and try to catch that video so that it will make more sense to you. And hopefully, Dewey will get them up a little more promptly so that they come out before we have the next class. Unfortunately, that didn't work out this week, but he promised he would try to do better. So we will certainly hope so. All right. Now, there is no temple as Ezekiel describes in those same chapters. There's no temple. But there's got to be a temple literally rebuilt in order to fulfill premillennial thinking. So when do you think the temple is going to be rebuilt? Right. During the 1,000-year, in connection with the return of Christ and the 1,000-year reign. Okay? So if you don't see it now, know that it's coming then. That's their basic philosophy. And since there's a good chance that many of them and many of us that may or may not be alive when the end of time comes, it's going to be hard for them to be disproven. That's one of the beauties of writing books and putting your projections out far enough into the future that there's a good chance you'll be dead before that year gets here. So even if you're wrong, there won't be anybody around. You won't be around to be criticized. Which reminds me of one of the mistakes that Mr. Hal Lindsey made when he wrote Late Great Planet Earth, because he had everything he needed too quick. We'll talk about that in some detail later on. But very briefly, in his book, that book, which is his most famous book of all, he said that the whole thing is going to end in, want to take a guess? How about 1984? Well, it didn't quite happen. Now, up until 1984, you couldn't say that it wasn't going to happen. But you could say with some surety that Christ is not going to come back and set up another kingdom. But you couldn't say the world wasn't going to come to an end in 1984 until 1985. And then you could confidently say, Mr. Lindsay, you're wrong. However, Mr. Lindsay had his book, and I'm trying to find this, had his book turned into a movie, which I was not aware of. There must be a movie out there, Late Great Planet Earth, and it was produced after 1984. Now that takes a pretty wild imagination. Make a movie about a date that's already passed and make it sell. Maybe people didn't watch the movie quite as much as they read the book. The book's selling, I'm sure it quit selling convincingly after 1984. It's kind of silly to read the book after 1984. Okay, I appreciate your time. I hope this is worthwhile to you. Like I said, I'm not only wanting to show premillennial doctrine, but I want to also show how the scriptures should be interpreted in order that we'll have a better understanding of how to read the prophets and make application from the prophets. So I thank you for your time, and we'll see you next week.